The moment the world tells you that you are worthless is often the moment destiny quietly begins to rewrite your story. The cold morning air carried the scent of pine, damp earth, and fading hope as Evelyn Carter stepped away from the Moonridge pack without looking back. Behind her, laughter drifted across the ceremonial grounds where wolves celebrated another successful mating ceremony. No one called her name. No one asked where she was going. Only an hour earlier, she had stood beneath the ancient moonstone, believing that after years of quiet endurance, her life might finally change. Instead, the alpha she had been promised looked into her eyes with nothing but disappointment before rejecting her in front of the entire pack. The silence that followed had hurt more than the words themselves. Even the people she had grown up beside lowered their eyes as though she had become invisible. Evelyn tightened her worn gray cloak around her shoulders and continued down the narrow forest trail. The cool breeze brushed against her pale skin while fallen leaves crunched beneath her boots. She had nowhere to go, only the certainty that she could not remain where every familiar face reminded her she no longer belonged. The deeper she walked into the towering pines, the quieter the world became. Sunlight filtered through the branches in thin ribbons of gold, painting shifting patterns across the forest floor. Somewhere above, birds called softly to one another, carrying on with ordinary life while hers seemed to have ended before it had truly begun. She paused beside a small creek, kneeling to rinse the dried tears from her face with icy water. Her reflection shimmered across the current, revealing tired blue eyes and loose strands of blonde hair escaping from a simple braid. She barely recognized the young woman staring back. "You'll be all right," she whispered to herself, though even her own voice sounded uncertain. Just as she stood to leave, a faint sound drifted through the trees. It was so quiet that she almost mistook it for the wind. Then it came again, a frightened child's cry. Evelyn froze. Her heartbeat quickened. Children were never supposed to wander this deep into the northern forest. The old trails beyond the creek had long been abandoned because rogue wolves were sometimes seen passing through during migration season. Every instinct told her to keep walking. She no longer owed this pack anything. No one would blame her for leaving. But the frightened cry came once more, weaker this time, carrying a fear no child should ever know. Evelyn turned without another thought and hurried toward the sound, weaving between towering trunks and low branches until she reached a small clearing hidden beneath a cluster of ancient oaks. Curled against the roots of the largest tree sat a little boy no older than 7. His clothes were torn by thorn bushes, his small hands trembling as he hugged his knees. His silver-gray eyes widened when he saw her, filled with the cautious hope only children could still possess after being frightened. "Please," he whispered, struggling to catch his breath. "Don't leave me." Evelyn's heart tightened. She slowly knelt several feet away so she would not frighten him further. "You're safe," she said gently. "My name is Evelyn. What's yours?" The boy hesitated, glancing nervously over his shoulder toward the dark woods before answering in a tiny voice. "Noah." "Where are your parents?" she asked softly. He lowered his head without replying. His silence said enough. Whether he was lost or separated, he had been alone for far too long. Evelyn carefully removed her cloak and wrapped it around his small shoulders. Though she owned almost nothing, she could not bear to watch him shiver. Noah looked up at her with surprise. "You'll be cold," he murmured. Evelyn smiled despite everything weighing on her heart. "I've survived colder days." For the first time since the rejection ceremony, the ache inside her chest eased just a little. She offered him her hand. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Noah reached toward her, but before their fingers met, distant howls echoed through the forest. They were low, unfamiliar, and far too close. Every bird in the clearing suddenly took flight. Noah's frightened expression drained of all color as he instinctively stepped behind Evelyn. She slowly turned toward the trees. Between the shadows, branches swayed although there was no wind. Something, or someone, was moving just beyond the edge of the clearing, watching them in complete silence. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. She had every reason to run. She had every reason to think only of herself after everything that had happened that morning. Yet without hesitation, she placed herself between the unseen danger and the trembling child behind her, never noticing the small silver crest embroidered inside the collar of Noah's cloak, the royal symbol hidden beneath the folds of fabric that could change both of their lives forever. Evelyn did not wait to discover what was hiding among the trees. The moment another branch snapped somewhere beyond the clearing, instinct took over. She gently pulled Noah behind her and searched the forest floor until she found a sturdy walking stick, gripping it with both hands even though she knew it would offer little protection against anything larger than a frightened deer. The woods had become unnaturally still. Even the breeze that had whispered through the pine needles moments earlier seemed to vanish. Noah's small fingers clung tightly to the back of her cloak. She could feel him trembling. "Stay close to me," she whispered without taking her eyes off the shadows. "Whatever happens, do not let go of my hand." He nodded without speaking. His breathing came in quick, uneven breaths, and Evelyn noticed fresh scratches across his wrists, as if he had pushed through thick brush for a long time before she found him. The sight tightened something inside her chest. Whatever had happened before they met, this child had already endured more fear than anyone his age should ever know. A low rustling drifted from the trees to their left. Evelyn slowly backed away, guiding Noah toward the narrow trail that led back to the creek. Every step felt painfully loud against the carpet of dry leaves. Suddenly, several dark shapes slipped between the distant trunks. They moved quickly but remained partially hidden, never fully revealing themselves. Whoever they were following. Evelyn swallowed hard. She had heard stories of rogue wolves wandering the northern forests after losing their packs, surviving by avoiding settlements and trusting no one. Whether these figures were rogues or frightened travelers, she could not know. What mattered was getting Noah somewhere safe before they caught up. "Can you run?" she asked softly. Noah looked up with determined silver eyes and nodded. "Then stay beside me." They hurried down the winding trail. Branches brushed against Evelyn's shoulders while roots reached across the uneven ground like hidden obstacles. She kept glancing over her shoulder. The distant figures never seemed to gain ground, yet they never disappeared either. It was as though they were patiently herding them deeper into the forest. The realization sent a chill racing through her. After several minutes they reached the creek she had crossed earlier that morning. The water flowed gently over smooth stones, no more than knee-deep, but the current was fast from recent rain. Evelyn stepped into the icy water first, then reached back for Noah. He hesitated only for a heartbeat before trusting her completely. His tiny hand slipped into hers. Together they crossed, the freezing current soaking their boots. On the opposite bank, Evelyn paused long enough to listen. Silence. Then, to her surprise, the movement behind them stopped. The distant figures remained on the other side of the creek, barely visible between the trees, as though unwilling to cross. One by one they faded back into the forest until nothing remained except shifting shadows. Evelyn released a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. Noah looked at her with wide eyes. "Are they gone?" he asked. "For now," she answered honestly. "But we should keep moving." The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long beams of amber light through the towering pines. They followed an old hunter's trail that few people still remembered. Evelyn recalled finding a small abandoned ranger cabin somewhere nearby when she was a child. If it was still standing, it could provide shelter until morning. Noah walked quietly beside her, occasionally glancing toward her as if making sure she was still there. After nearly an hour, he finally spoke. "Why? Did you help me?" Evelyn smiled gently without slowing her pace. "Because you needed someone." He lowered his eyes. Everyone else ran away. Her heart ached at the simple confession. "Not everyone," she said. Noah was silent for several moments before asking another question. "Did someone hurt you too?" Evelyn almost laughed at the unexpected honesty of children. She looked ahead toward the fading trail. "Yes," she admitted softly. "But sometimes pain reminds us to become the person we once needed ourselves." Noah seemed to think about those words very carefully. A faint smile appeared across his tired face for the first time since they met. As evening settled over the forest, the outline of the abandoned cabin finally emerged between the trees. Its weathered wooden walls leaned slightly with age, but the roof remained intact. Evelyn felt a spark of relief. They had found shelter before darkness completely covered the woods. She stepped onto the creaking porch and slowly pushed open the old door. Dust floated through the fading sunlight, and the tiny room smelled of cedar and forgotten seasons. It was empty. Safe, at least for now. Noah quietly removed her cloak from around his shoulders and held it out to her. Before she could thank him, The fading light caught the inside of his collar once again. This time the silver embroidery was impossible to miss. It was not an ordinary family crest. Evelyn had seen that symbol only once before from a great distance during a royal procession years earlier. Her heartbeat stopped as she stared at the unmistakable mark of the Alpha King's household, while outside, somewhere deep beyond the trees, the distant sound of approaching horses echoed through the evening air. The distant hoofbeats grew louder with every passing second until they echoed through the quiet forest like rolling thunder. Evelyn instinctively stepped away from the cabin doorway and gently guided Noah behind her once again. The fading sunlight painted long shadows across the clearing, turning every movement between the trees into a silent question. She had no idea who was coming, but after everything that had happened that day, she refused to trust anyone. Too quickly, Noah's fingers found the sleeve of her dress. They trembled slightly, yet he did not hide. He simply stood close enough to know she would not leave him. Evelyn glanced down at the silver crest stitched inside his collar once more. There could be no mistake. She had seen that symbol years ago during a royal celebration when the Alpha King's banner passed through neighboring territories. It belonged to the Blackwood family. Her pulse quickened. The frightened little boy she had found alone in the woods was somehow connected to the royal household. Before she could ask another question, the sound of horses suddenly stopped just beyond the trees. Silence settled over the clearing. Even the birds seemed unwilling to sing. Evelyn slowly closed the cabin door without making a sound and lowered her voice. "Noah, tell me the truth. Who are you?" The little boy stared at the wooden floor for several long seconds. His silver eyes filled with uncertainty, as though he had been carrying a secret much too heavy for someone his age. "Father says I should never tell strangers my name," he whispered. Evelyn nodded gently. That was good advice. He looked up at her. "But you are not a stranger anymore." Those simple words caught her completely off guard. She smiled despite the growing danger outside. "Then tell me only what you feel comfortable sharing." Noah hesitated again before quietly saying, "Some people have been following me since this morning. They wanted to take me somewhere. My guards told me to run while they distracted them. I kept running until I could not find anyone anymore." His voice became smaller with every sentence. "I thought everyone forgot me." Evelyn slowly knelt so their eyes were level. "No one who matters has forgotten you." The child searched her face as though trying to decide whether to believe those words. Then he asked something that made her heart ache. "If they find me, will you still stay?" Without thinking, Evelyn answered immediately, "Yes." Noah released a shaky breath and leaned against her shoulder for just a moment, as though allowing himself to believe he was finally safe. Evelyn carefully wrapped her arms around him in a gentle embrace. It was the kind of comfort she herself had desperately needed only hours earlier, but had never received. Outside, dry leaves rustled across the porch. A heavy boot stepped onto the old wooden boards. Another followed. Whoever had arrived was close enough to touch the door. Evelyn slowly released Noah and stood. She looked around the tiny cabin. There was nowhere to hide. One weathered table, a stone fireplace, and a single narrow window facing the forest. That was all. A firm knock echoed through the room. Neither of them moved. Another knock followed, louder this time. Then a deep voice called from outside. "We know someone is inside. We are not here to harm anyone." Evelyn exchanged a cautious glance with Noah. The little boy's expression had turned pale again. Instead of answering the voice, he instinctively reached for her hand. She squeezed it reassuringly. "Stay behind me," she whispered. The silence stretched for several seconds before the mysterious voice spoke once more. "Young Master Noah, if you can hear me, please answer. We have been searching for you since sunrise." Noah's eyes widened. Relief and fear collided across his face at the same time. He took one hesitant step toward the door before suddenly stopping. "I know that voice," he whispered. "He works for my father." Evelyn frowned. If that was true, why had Noah looked so frightened? Before she could ask another question, another distant howl rolled through the forest, much closer than before. The men outside instantly drew silent. Their horses shifted nervously. Even through the cabin walls, Evelyn sensed the sudden tension spreading across the clearing. Whatever had been following Noah all day had finally caught up to everyone. The howl faded into the distance, but the uneasy silence that followed felt even heavier. Outside the cabin, no one moved. Evelyn could hear horses shifting their weight and the faint creak of leather saddles. Yet the men remained perfectly still, as though they were waiting for something hidden within the forest to reveal itself first. She slowly reached for the wooden latch and looked at Noah. "Do you trust them?" she asked quietly. The little boy listened for a moment before giving the smallest nod. "I know some of their voices," he whispered. "But Father always says that knowing someone is not the same as trusting them." Evelyn almost smiled. Those were wise words for a child so young. She carefully opened the cabin door only a few inches. Evening light spilled across the worn wooden floor. Standing several yards away were 6 riders dressed in dark cloaks, bearing the silver wolf crest she had already recognized. None of them held a threatening posture. Their eyes were fixed on the surrounding forest instead of the cabin, as though they feared danger might appear from any direction. One older man with streaks of gray in his dark hair slowly stepped forward and lowered his hands where everyone could see them. "Miss," he said calmly, "my name is Gareth. I serve the royal household. We have searched every trail since dawn." Evelyn studied his face carefully. He looked exhausted rather than dangerous. Dust covered his boots, and concern filled his tired eyes. "If you truly serve the royal household," she replied, "tell me why a child wearing your family's crest was alone in these woods." Gareth closed his eyes briefly, carrying the weight of a question he clearly wished he did not have to answer. "That is a story for his father to explain, not me." Before Evelyn could answer, Noah quietly stepped past her shoulder. "Gareth." The older man's expression changed instantly. Relief washed across his face so quickly that his eyes became bright with emotion. He dropped to one knee without hesitation. Every rider behind him did the same. "Young master," Gareth said softly, "thank the moon that you are safe." Noah looked toward Evelyn before taking another step outside. "She protected me," he said. "She stayed when everyone else disappeared." Gareth slowly lifted his eyes toward Evelyn. Respect replaced the uncertainty that had been there moments earlier. "Then the royal household owes you more than words can express." Evelyn shook her head gently. "I only did what anyone should have done." Gareth's expression became unexpectedly sad. You would be surprised how few people actually would. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the rich scent of pine, cold stone, and rain. Every horse immediately lifted its head. The riders straightened without speaking. Gareth turned toward the forest path and quietly bowed his head. Someone important was approaching. The sound of another horse echoed through the trees. Unlike the others, its footsteps were slow and measured, carrying absolute confidence instead of urgency. A tall black stallion emerged between the pines, moving as gracefully as flowing water. Upon its back sat a man wrapped in a dark traveling cloak that concealed much of his face beneath a broad hood. Yet nothing could hide the quiet authority surrounding him. The entire clearing seemed to hold its breath. Even the evening wind became still. Evelyn instinctively stepped forward until she stood between the stranger and Noah once again. She knew nothing about the rider except that everyone else immediately lowered their heads in silent respect. The man guided his horse to a stop several yards away before slowly dismounting. His boots touched the forest floor without making a sound. For a long moment, he simply stood there, studying Evelyn with calm silver eyes beneath the shadow of his hood. There was no anger in his expression, only careful observation. Noah suddenly smiled with a joy Evelyn had not seen before. He ran past her without hesitation. "Father," he called. The cloaked man immediately knelt and opened his arms. Noah rushed into the embrace, holding tightly as though every fear from the day finally melted away. Evelyn stood completely frozen. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the forest around her. Gareth lowered his head even farther before speaking with quiet reverence. "Your Majesty, we have found the prince." Evelyn slowly looked from the kneeling riders to the child in the stranger's arms. The truth settled over her all at once. The little boy she had protected was the Alpha King's only son, and the man now rising to his feet, while gently resting one hand upon the child's shoulder, was none other than King Lucian Blackwood himself. His steady silver gaze met Evelyn's once again, and before anyone else could speak, he took one measured step toward the woman who had stood between his son and every danger without knowing whose life she was risking her own to protect. For several heartbeats, Evelyn could not find her voice. She had imagined meeting the Alpha King only through distant stories whispered around village fires, stories that painted him as untouchable, relentless, and impossible to approach. Yet the man standing before her looked only at his son. King Lucian Blackwood rested one steady hand upon Noah's shoulder, carefully searching the boy's face as though making certain he was truly unharmed. There was relief in his silver eyes, quiet but unmistakable, and it softened the powerful presence that surrounded him. Only after Noah offered a small, reassuring smile did the king slowly lift his gaze toward Evelyn again. "You stayed with him," he said in a calm, measured voice. It was not a question. Evelyn lowered her eyes respectfully. "He was alone, Your Majesty." Lucian studied her for another long moment. His attention moved to the worn cloak draped over Noah's shoulders, then to the scratches along Evelyn's hands where branches had caught her while leading the child through the forest. Nothing escaped his notice. Gareth stepped forward and quietly explained everything the search party had learned, including where they had found the abandoned cabin and the trail leading back toward the creek. The king listened without interrupting. When Gareth finished, Lucian walked toward the cabin entrance instead of speaking immediately. He knelt beside the dusty wooden floor and gently brushed his fingertips across several faint footprints preserved in the dirt. Outside, he examined broken twigs, disturbed leaves, and small impressions left near the edge of the clearing. Evelyn watched in surprise as the king pieced together the story without anyone guiding him. He stopped beside a patch of flattened grass where Noah had first stepped behind her. Nearby, the deeper marks from Evelyn's own boots showed that she had remained between the child and the approaching danger. Lucian looked toward Gareth. She placed herself in front of him. It was another quiet statement rather than a question. Gareth nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." The king's eyes returned to Evelyn. "You did not know who he was." "No. Yet you still chose to protect him." Evelyn hesitated before answering. "He was a frightened child." That was enough. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the royal guards exchanged thoughtful glances. They had expected gratitude from the king, perhaps a formal reward, but something about his silence felt deeper than simple appreciation. Noah suddenly tugged on his father's sleeve. "She gave me her cloak," he said proudly. "And she crossed the creek holding my hand because I was scared." Lucian looked down at his son with gentle patience. "Were you afraid?" Noah nodded. "Not after she found me." Those 5 words settled over the clearing with unexpected weight. Evelyn noticed Gareth quietly lowering his head again, while several guards seemed visibly moved by the child's honesty. Lucian turned back toward her. Most people who discover they are protecting someone important begin asking what reward they will receive. Evelyn shook her head almost immediately. "I did not help him because he was important. I helped him because he was alone." A faint breeze lifted loose strands of her blonde hair across her face. She brushed them aside awkwardly, suddenly aware of how simple and worn her clothing appeared beside the royal household. She expected the conversation to end there. Instead, the king asked one final question. "Why were you walking through the northern forest by yourself today?" The warmth that had slowly entered the evening disappeared almost instantly. Evelyn lowered her gaze toward the ground. "My pack no longer considers me one of their own." She did not offer further explanation. She did not mention the rejection ceremony, the laughter, or the humiliation she had endured that very morning. She simply spoke the truth as plainly as she could. Noah looked up at her in confusion. "They sent you away?" Evelyn forced a gentle smile. Sometimes life changes very quickly. Before anyone could continue the conversation, one of the royal scouts emerged from the forest carrying several pieces of torn dark fabric discovered along the trail. Gareth examined them carefully before handing them to the king. Lucian's expression hardened for the first time that evening. "These are not from our guards," Gareth said quietly. "Someone else was tracking the prince." Lucian closed his hand around the fabric without another word. Then he looked toward the dark forest stretching beyond the clearing, his silver eyes growing distant and thoughtful. Whoever had been following Noah had disappeared before the royal party arrived, leaving behind only scattered traces and unanswered questions. The king slowly turned back toward Evelyn, and for reasons she could not explain, she sensed that her unexpected place in this story had only just begun. Night settled over the forest as the royal escort prepared to leave the abandoned cabin behind. Torches flickered to life one by one, their warm glow pushing back the darkness gathering beneath the towering pines. Gareth quietly organized the riders while several scouts disappeared into the trees to search for any remaining signs of whoever had followed the prince. King Lucian remained unusually still, his attention fixed on the narrow trail leading away from the clearing. He was not simply watching the road. He was thinking. Evelyn stood a respectful distance away, uncertain whether she should stay or quietly leave before anyone decided her presence was no longer necessary. She had expected the king to thank her and continue his journey. Instead, he approached once more with calm, measured steps. "Where were you planning to go after leaving your pack?" he asked. Evelyn hesitated. It was the first time anyone had asked that question since the rejection ceremony. "I did not know," she admitted honestly. "I only knew I could not stay where I was no longer welcome." Lucian studied her expression without judgment. "Do you have family elsewhere?" She slowly shook her head. "No, Your Majesty." Noah looked from his father to Evelyn, his young face filled with concern. "Then she cannot walk alone tonight," he said quietly. "The forest is too dangerous." Lucian rested one hand on his son's shoulder, acknowledging the truth in those words. Before he could respond, one of the returning scouts rode into the clearing at a fast pace before bringing his horse to a careful stop. He dismounted immediately and handed Gareth a small leather pouch. Gareth opened it and frowned. "This was found near the creek," he reported, "hidden beneath the roots of a fallen tree." Lucian accepted the pouch and examined the symbol pressed into the worn leather. It was unfamiliar to Evelyn, but she noticed the subtle change in the king's expression. His calm demeanor remained, yet his silver eyes grew sharper. "This does not belong to my household," Gareth said. "No." Lucian closed the pouch in his hand. "Someone prepared this route before today." Evelyn listened in silence. She suddenly realized that Noah becoming lost had not been a simple accident. Whatever had happened began long before she heard a frightened child calling for help in the forest. Gareth turned toward the king. "Should we question nearby packs tonight?" Lucian shook his head. "Not yet." The answer surprised everyone. Gareth blinked. "Your Majesty? If someone planned this carefully, they will already know the prince is safe. They will be watching how we respond." His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet certainty. "Let them believe we know less than we do." The guards nodded without another question. Evelyn found herself watching the king with growing admiration. He did not rush toward anger or suspicion. He observed first, allowing every piece of the puzzle to settle into place before acting. Noah wandered back to Evelyn while the adults continued speaking. He slipped his small hand into hers as naturally as if they had known each other for years. "Will you come with us?" he asked softly. Evelyn looked down at him with gentle surprise. "I do not think that is my decision." Noah looked toward his father. "Can she?" Lucian turned at exactly that moment, having clearly heard every word despite standing several yards away. For a long second, he remained silent. "Until we understand who was following my son," he finally said, "I would prefer that everyone connected to today's events remain under royal protection." Evelyn blinked. "Including me?" "Especially you." She did not understand. "Why?" Lucian answered with complete honesty. "Because whoever searched for Noah also knows that you found him first." A quiet chill passed through the clearing. Evelyn had been thinking only about the prince's safety. She had never considered that simply helping him might place her in danger as well. Noah squeezed her hand a little tighter. "See," he said with complete confidence. "I told you that you should not be alone anymore." Before Evelyn could answer, another scout emerged from the darkness carrying something wrapped in cloth. Gareth uncovered it carefully. Inside lay a simple silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. Evelyn's breath caught. She recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her mother, and she had lost it somewhere along the forest trail while searching for Noah. Gareth looked at the pendant, then at Evelyn in confusion. "Is this yours?" She nodded quietly. Lucian accepted the pendant and turned it over in his hand. His eyes rested upon an intricate engraving hidden on the back, one that had been concealed beneath years of wear. His expression changed almost imperceptibly as though he recognized the ancient symbol etched into the silver. Without explaining why, he carefully closed his fingers around the pendant before lifting his gaze to Evelyn again. And for the second time that evening, the Alpha King looked at her with the unmistakable expression of a man who had just discovered something he had not expected to find. Before dawn, The royal procession left the forest and traveled toward Blackwood's citadel beneath a sky slowly turning from deep blue to silver. The towering fortress appeared above the cliffs like something carved from the mountains themselves, its stone walls glowing softly in the early morning light. Evelyn had never imagined she would cross its gates. Only nobles, royal guards, and honored guests were ever welcomed inside. Yet she entered wearing the same simple dress she had worn when she was rejected only the day before. The contrast felt almost unreal. Noah rode beside his father for most of the journey, but every few minutes he looked back to make certain Evelyn was still there. Whenever their eyes met, he smiled with quiet relief. It was the smile of a child who no longer feared being left behind. Inside the castle, servants hurried respectfully through wide halls lined with ancient banners, though many slowed as they noticed the unfamiliar young woman walking beside the prince. Curious whispers followed them, but no one dared ask questions while the Alpha King remained nearby. Lucian finally led the small group into a private council chamber where only Gareth and two trusted advisors waited. The heavy oak doors closed behind them, shutting out the sounds of the busy palace. The king placed Evelyn's silver pendant upon the polished table. "Tell me everything you know about this," he said gently. Evelyn looked at the familiar necklace with a mixture of sadness and surprise. "It belonged to my mother," she answered. "She gave it to me before she passed away when I was very young. She never explained where it came from. She only told me never to lose it because one day it would help me remember who I truly was." Gareth exchanged a quick glance with the advisors. Lucian remained thoughtful. "Did your mother belong to the Moonridge Pack?" Evelyn slowly shook her head. "She arrived there long before I was born. No one ever spoke about her past." The king carefully turned the pendant over once more. "This engraving has not been used for nearly 20 years. Evelyn frowned. "You recognize it?" Before Lucian could answer, a royal messenger hurried into the chamber and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, representatives from Moonridge Pack have arrived unexpectedly. They are requesting an immediate audience." Evelyn felt her heartbeat quicken. Her former pack was here. Gareth looked surprised. "They traveled through the night." Lucian nodded calmly. "Escort them to the grand hall." He turned toward Evelyn. "You will come with us." Confusion crossed her face. "Me? Yes." Minutes later, the enormous hall filled with quiet anticipation. High windows flooded the chamber with golden morning light while nobles, officers, and palace officials gathered along the sides, curious about the unexpected meeting. At the center stood the Alpha of Moonridge Pack along with several elders who had witnessed Evelyn's rejection ceremony. The moment they noticed her entering beside the royal household, visible surprise flashed across their faces before quickly disappearing behind polite smiles. The Pack Alpha stepped forward and bowed respectfully toward Lucian. "Your Majesty, we came the moment we learned the prince had safely returned." "You learned quickly," Lucian observed. "News travels fast." The Alpha smiled carefully. "We were also informed that one of our former pack members happened to encounter the prince." He glanced toward Evelyn with practiced sympathy. "Poor girl. She has always been eager to prove herself. I only regret that she wandered away before we could properly assist in the search." Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. Not once during the previous day had anyone from Moonridge searched for her after the rejection ceremony. Yet now they spoke as though they had always cared. Another elder stepped forward. "In fact, several of our hunters spent hours looking through the forest after hearing rumors of danger." Gareth quietly folded his arms, saying nothing. Lucian also remained completely silent. He neither agreed nor challenged a single statement. The silence encouraged the visitors. The Pack Alpha continued speaking with growing confidence. "Naturally, if our hunters had reached the boy first, we would have protected him with complete loyalty." Noah, who had been standing quietly beside his father until that moment, slowly looked up. His young face showed honest confusion. "But that is not what happened," he said. Every voice in the hall disappeared. The child took one small step forward and looked directly at the visitors. "I was alone until Evelyn found me. I never saw any hunters from your pack. She gave me her cloak. She held my hand across the creek. She stayed with me when everyone else was gone." The room became so quiet that the crackling fireplace sounded impossibly loud. Lucian still had not spoken a single word. He simply watched the expressions of the Moonridge delegation change as the confidence they had entered with slowly began to disappear. No one in the grand hall dared to speak after Noah's quiet words settled into the silence. The confidence that had carried the Moonridge delegation into the palace slowly faded beneath the steady gaze of the Alpha King. Lucian remained seated upon the raised platform, his expression impossible to read, while the morning sunlight poured through the towering windows and illuminated every face in the chamber. The Pack Alpha attempted a polite smile. "Children are often confused after frightening experiences, Your Majesty." Noah immediately shook his head. "I remember everything." His clear voice echoed through the hall. "Evelyn found me beside the old oak tree. She wrapped me in her cloak because I was cold. She crossed the creek holding my hand because I was afraid. She stayed with me all night. No one else came until Father did." The room remained perfectly still. Gareth stepped forward carrying a small leather satchel. Without a word, he placed several carefully collected items upon the long table before the throne. There were broken branches from the forest trail, the abandoned leather pouch discovered near the creek, and finally Evelyn's silver pendant. "Our investigation confirms the prince's account," Gareth announced calmly. "The footprints near the cabin belonged only to the prince and Miss Carter until the royal search party arrived. No evidence places members of Moonridge Pack anywhere near the child before that moment." Several nobles exchanged quiet glances. The Pack Alpha's composed expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps our hunters searched another section of the forest," one elder suggested. Lucian finally spoke. His voice was calm, yet every syllable carried unmistakable authority. "That is possible." Hope briefly returned to the visitors' faces. Then the king continued. "What is not possible is claiming credit for a rescue you did not perform." The simple statement landed with greater force than any raised voice ever could. No one attempted to interrupt him. Lucian slowly descended the steps leading from the throne and walked toward Evelyn, who still stood quietly near the edge of the chamber, uncertain whether she even belonged in such a place. He stopped beside her and turned to face the assembled court. "This young woman expected nothing in return for protecting my son. She did not know his name. She did not know his title. She knew only that a frightened child needed help." Evelyn lowered her eyes, uncomfortable with so much attention. She had never sought recognition. She had simply followed her heart. Lucian then reached into his cloak and revealed the silver pendant once more. The ancient engraving on its reverse caught the morning light. An elderly royal historian standing among the advisors suddenly inhaled sharply. "Your Majesty," he whispered, stepping closer with visible astonishment. "That mark belongs to the House of Silverbrook." Murmurs swept across the chamber. Evelyn looked up in confusion. She had never heard that name before. The historian bowed respectfully toward her before speaking again. Silverbrook was one of the oldest guardian families to serve the royal bloodline generations ago. Their symbol disappeared many years ago after the family vanished from public record. Evelyn stared at the pendant resting in Lucian's hand. Her mother had carried that secret her entire life without ever explaining it. Lucian looked thoughtfully at the young woman before him. "It seems your past is not exactly what you believed." Before Evelyn could answer, Noah hurried across the polished floor and slipped his small hand into hers once again. "I told you," he said with a bright smile. "You belong here." A gentle warmth spread through the hall as several members of the royal court smiled at the child's sincerity. Even Gareth's usually reserved expression softened. The Moonridge delegation, however, stood in uneasy silence. They had arrived expecting praise for their supposed loyalty. Instead, they had witnessed the rejected Omega they had cast aside earn the respect of the entire royal household. Lucian looked toward the delegation one final time. "Truth has a way of revealing itself," he said quietly. "Sometimes through evidence, sometimes through courage, and sometimes through the honesty of a child." No one challenged him. As the morning light continued to fill the hall, Evelyn glanced down at Noah's small hand wrapped around hers, and then toward the king. Standing only a few feet away, for the first time since her rejection, she no longer felt invisible. Yet deep inside, she sensed that the mystery surrounding her mother's pendant and the forgotten name of Silverbrook had only opened the first door to a destiny far greater than anyone in that room had yet begun to understand. Several days passed before the great bell of Blackwood Citadel rang across the valley, calling nobles, pack leaders, and citizens into the royal courtyard. News had spread throughout every neighboring territory that the Alpha King would make an official announcement concerning the disappearance of Prince Noah and the mysterious young Omega who had returned with him. Hundreds gathered beneath banners that fluttered in the gentle autumn breeze while sunlight washed across the ancient stone walls. Evelyn stood quietly near the front of the courtyard wearing a simple cream-colored dress provided by the royal household. She still felt more comfortable in ordinary clothes, yet nothing could hide the quiet grace that came from her kindness rather than fine fabric. Noah stood beside her, refusing to let go of her hand even as royal officials tried to guide him toward his father. Each time they asked, he smiled and politely shook his head. Finally, Lucian simply smiled and allowed his son to remain where he wished. The king stepped onto the raised platform overlooking the assembled crowd. His voice carried clearly across the courtyard without ever needing to rise. Many of you have heard different versions of what happened in the northern forest. Today you will hear only the truth. Gareth presented the findings gathered by the royal investigation. The forest trail, the abandoned cabin, the prince's testimony, the search records, and every piece of evidence pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Evelyn Carter had protected the heir to the kingdom without knowing who he was and without asking for anything in return. The courtyard remained silent as every detail was revealed. Lucian then turned toward the delegation from Moonridge Pack. A community is measured not by how it treats the powerful, but by how it treats those with no power at all. The words settled over the crowd like the morning light. No harsh punishment followed. Instead, the king announced that Moonridge Pack would lose several royal privileges until it demonstrated through its actions that every member of its community would be treated with fairness and dignity. The decision was firm, measured, and impossible to argue against. Then Lucian faced the crowd once more. Courage does not announce itself with titles. Character does not depend upon rank. A kingdom is safest when good people choose compassion before recognition. He extended Evelyn's silver pendant toward her with both hands, returning it not as forgotten jewelry, but as part of her family's history. "This belongs to you," he said. "The legacy of Silverbrook will not be forgotten again." Evelyn accepted the pendant with trembling hands. Tears gathered in her blue eyes, not because she had gained a noble name, but because for the first time since losing her mother, she no longer felt alone in the world. Before she could thank the king, Noah wrapped both arms around her waist with the complete sincerity that only a child possesses. He looked up at her and smiled. "You promised you would not leave." Evelyn gently brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead. "I remember." Noah looked toward his father. "Can she stay with us?" A warm ripple of laughter moved gently through the gathered crowd. Lucian descended from the platform until he stood beside them. His silver eyes met Evelyn's with quiet respect. "If you choose to remain here," he said, "you will always have a place within this household. Not because of a debt, not because of obligation, because my son trusts you, and because you have already shown the kind of heart that no crown can create." Evelyn looked around the courtyard filled with people who no longer saw her as the rejected Omega from a forgotten ceremony. They saw the woman who had chosen kindness when no one was watching. She looked back at Lucian and gave a small grateful nod. "I would be honored." Noah beamed with happiness and reached for both of their hands at the same time, proudly standing between them as though the choice had always been obvious. Together they walked slowly toward the palace entrance while the people of Blackwood lowered their heads in quiet respect. Evelyn realized that the path leading away from her old life had never truly been a road of loss. It had been the first step toward finding the family she never expected, the purpose she never imagined, and the home she had been searching for all along. Sometimes destiny does not arrive with thunder or triumph. Sometimes it begins with a frightened child, a simple act of compassion, and one person who chooses to stay when everyone else walks away.